All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started today. Just a friendly reminder that these webinars are intended for educational purposes only. And while we hope that you learn new information, the trainers presenting these webinars are not attorneys. Therefore, all information provided during the presentation and the Q&A session should not be construed as legal advice. All right, well, with that out of the way, good afternoon. My name is Brianna Grimes, and I'm the Senior HR Services Advisor for Pay Entry. And today we're going to be talking about emergency preparedness plans. Now, remember, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box, and they will be addressed during the Q&A session at the very end of this session. All right, with that being said, let's jump into our content. So emergency preparedness has really taken on a whole new meaning for employers in light of COVID-19 and just the past year of things that we've gone through. And now is a really great time to prepare your organization for emergencies or even dusting off your existing emergency preparedness plans and really making sure that they're up to date. So to help you do this, today we're going to be talking about a couple different topics. So we're going to talk about emergency action plans, also known as EAPs, types of emergencies that emergency plans should cover, state-specific laws, action items for you to take going forward, and then we will end with a Q&A session. All right, so let's start by talking about an emergency action plan, or EAP for short. Whenever employers, HR professionals, or even legal counsel talks about emergency preparedness in the workplace, they're almost always referring to the OSHA guidelines document known as the EAP. Now, this is not to be confused with the Employee Assistance Program, which is also shortened to the acronym EAP. In HR, we do love our acronyms, so just kind of keep that in mind that EAP could either be Employee Assistance Program or Emergency Action Plan, depending on what you're talking about. So first, let's talk about what an EAP is and related to emergency preparedness. Well, it is an emergency action plan, and it's a written document that is required by OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Again, we love our acronyms, to facilitate and organize employer and employee actions during workplace emergencies. Now, this is a very important document, and as we have all learned firsthand from the whole COVID-19 crisis, it's much better to have a plan in place going into an emergency situation than it is to try to develop one in the middle of a crisis. So the next question is then, who is required by OSHA to have an EAP in place? Well, some of you may not like this answer. Virtually almost every business is actually required by OSHA to have an EAP in place, regardless of how small or large your business is. There are a couple exceptions to this rule. The first exception is if you have an entirely remote workforce, meaning everybody works from their home 100% of the time. You do not have an office environment. The second exception is if you have a trained fire or emergency team or brigade within your company and on staff at all times. Now, some of you might be like, well, no company has that. Think Disneyland or Walt Disney World, or if there's certain theme parks and large organizations that are almost functioning like a small city. They actually do have their own fire and police force, actually. So these are the two very minor exceptions to this rule. And it's very safe for us to assume that almost all of you on this webinar today are required to have an EAP in place, because I'm sure none of you have your own fire brigade on staff. So some of you may have an EAP in place already, and you actively review it every year. Now, others of you may not have looked at your current EAP for a while, or you may not have one at all. And that's okay, because this webinar is going to help you become compliant in order to pass that OSHA audit if you ever experience one. So we're going to take a look at what the minimum requirements for an EAP is for your organization. So before we dive into the exact requirements of the content of the EAP, I want to look at the minimum requirements as far as communication first. So this is what you are required to communicate your EAP plan to the employees as the employer. So first and foremost, your EAP has to be in writing. The only exception to this is unless you have less than 10 employees in your organization, then you are permitted to communicate this plan to them orally per OSHA guidelines. However, I would caution that depending on what state your business is in, as well as the nature of your business, a physical document is something that you should consider investing time into anyway. Nothing can really replace a physical document and those physical acknowledgments from employees. And if it ever came down to the company being held liable for something, especially in an emergency, those documents come into play to protect your organization. So choose this format wisely if you are a smaller company, and take into consideration some of those factors that may guide you into putting your EAP in writing anyway. Also, additionally, the document must be kept in the workplace at all times, and it has to be available for employees to review it at any time. So don't keep it in a safe in the boss's office. A lot of places actually keep it up at the front in a binder with the receptionist, and all employees know that they can get it with the receptionist or the executive assistant or the HR professional, and they know that they can access it at any time. I also highly recommend including this document as a part of employees' onboarding processes so they can download the document and have their own personal copy along with the one made available for employee access. So if you want to include kind of evacuation plans and what types of emergencies you might experience based on your geographical location, those would be good things to include in your onboarding process, especially if you have employees. I know a lot of people right now are relocating. We're seeing an increase in employees relocating out of state and families moving far away from other family units. So we're seeing a lot of people move into cities and states that they've never lived in before. So this is also a really good way to make sure that employees who may have never experienced an earthquake or a tornado kind of understand what that process might look like if your organization is in a place that experiences those on a regular basis. So what exactly goes into the document required by OSHA? Well, there are some minimum requirements that are dictated by OSHA, but these requirements may not be the only minimum requirements. So keep that in mind as we go over this. Many states actually have mandates pertaining to what information must be included in an EAP. So it's always good to reference your local laws as well as the laws of the states where your employees work for you. So if you have multiple locations, you may have multiple different EAPs for each location because the requirements might differ. So this is another thing to look into. So here are the minimum EAP content requirements per the federal OSHA guidelines. The first is that the document must include procedures for reporting a fire or any other emergency in the workplace. So you have to let your employees know exactly what the process is for reporting emergencies of any kind. The next piece is emergency evacuation procedures, and they must include the type of evacuation as well as all exit route assignments for that evacuation. Now, keep in mind that different types of emergencies may have different evacuation procedures. So your EAP may have more than one evacuation included in your document. Now, your EAP must also include procedures that management will follow to account for all employees post-evacuation at the chosen rendezvous point. So you will have to designate exactly who and how employees will be accounted for to ensure that no one is left in the building if it was a fire, and to make sure that everyone is accounted for. You also must have a procedure pertaining to employees needing to perform any type of rescue or medical duties. Even if this policy and procedure that you include is simply that your stance forbids employees to be heroes and deters them from attempting to rescue other people or perform any type of medical procedure they're not qualified to perform, that's fine. You can put that in the document, but you need to address exactly what you do allow and do not allow employees to do with regards to performing rescues or any type of medical duties. And finally, the document needs to include the name and job title of every employee who may be contacted by other employees that need more information about the plan or an explanation of their duties under the plan. Now, this may not be limited to only the leaders in the organization or HR. You'll find that in a lot of, EAP documents, in a lot of EAP documents, there are assigned what we call safety roles. And if there are employees filling those safety roles, they must also be listed in that document as points of contact because they have to be familiar with the role that they serve. Now, along with those previous requirements, there are some additional miscellaneous requirements pertaining to the EAP that must be adhered to. Employers must maintain an employee alarm system that uses distinctive signals for each purpose and complies with the requirements. So think about this as when you were in grade school and there were different alarms. So the fire alarm was, the beep, beep, beep sound. But maybe if you were in an area with tornadoes, the tornado warning or even an earthquake warning may have been the beep, the long drawn out beep for 30 seconds. Those are signals. That's what they're talking about. So there needs to be some type of signal system for your company to alert employees of an emergency so they know what procedures to follow immediately. Now, some of these signals might even include code words. So if you don't have any type of alarm system that you can operate with, like a beep type of thing, like at a school, you can always, if you have a loudspeaker or if you have a code word to a certain person or a safety position or things like that, these are things that you can develop in lieu of having an alarm system. But there has to be some type of signal that you need to have in this document. Also, employers are required to designate and train employees for evacuations. Now, for different types of evacuations, like I said, there may be safety officers or members of leadership that have to clear certain areas of the building or even be in positions in places like the top of a stairwell to ensure that no one falls and gets injured while evacuating downstairs. So there's a lot of key safety roles that are going to be included in this document, and you will have to review these with the employees and designate who is going to be in each role, as well as train employees on the role that they need to be filling. Also, any employee that is a key part of the evacuation must be trained on their role annually, and the overall evacuation procedure should be done on an annual basis as well. Also, the EAP must be reviewed with each employee covered by the plan. And that can happen either when the plan is first developed or the employee is first assigned a job within the EAP, when the employee's responsibilities or role changes in the plan, or when the plan is changed in any way. So these are the three instances in which you will have to review the EAP with each employee. And you don't have to do it one-on-one. Obviously, you can send it out or do a training class or a drill or however you would like to do it. All right, so now that we've talked about the EAP structure and requirements itself, let's look at what types of emergencies the EAP should cover. So they can cover things like fires, smoke or high carbon monoxide levels, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods and or tsunamis, blizzards and extreme temperatures, hazardous material spills, biohazard, chemical warfare exposure, pandemics, and even bomb threats or active shooters on site. Now, oftentimes when we think of emergency preparedness, we think of natural disasters such as extreme weather or even malfunctions with machinery that may cause a small fire or an oil spill. But as employers, sometimes we fail to recognize that biohazards and chemical exposure, or even pandemics and things like bomb threats or active shooters are just as important to be prepared for. Now, some of these topics would not be covered in your specific EAP based on your geographical region. So for example, I grew up in Las Vegas where we had a lot of flooding issues. So when we got a heavy rainfall each year, there was always these notices about floods and how to be prepared for floods. Well, businesses in Las Vegas would need, flooding procedures in their EAP, but not necessarily hurricanes or tsunamis or blizzards because those don't happen in Las Vegas. And another example is California. California is going to be more prepared for earthquakes and fires, where a state like Michigan is going to have to be more prepared for blizzards and extreme temperatures. So other categories that are not really geographically correlated may be based on the type of industry that you work in. So the typical office environment will probably never have to deal with a biohazard or chemical exposure unless you may work in the same building as an R&D or a medical facility. Sometimes it is a really good idea if you're in a common office environment to know your neighboring businesses and their lines of work, because they can actually expose your workforce to hazards that you may not have thought of prior. So for example, when the COVID-19 crisis first hit last year, I had a company that was located in the same building as a doctor's office, and we had to develop a completely different set of practices and procedures than most businesses did in order to ensure the safety of their employees because of the common areas that some of her patients, possibly with COVID, were going to be touching and interacting with on their way to the doctor's appointment. And this was putting other employees potentially at risk. And then there are emergencies like the bomb threats or active shooters that many companies don't really think about, but probably should. And unfortunately, this is the world that we live in, where active shooters can shut down an outdoor concert or a bomb can really halt the entire Boston Marathon in a split second. And yes, these were public events, but what about, for example, an employee who's going through an ugly divorce and the spouse is a heavy drinker and owns a gun? In one of my previous positions, that was exactly the situation that occurred. And we were very lucky that 6 months earlier, I had worked very hard with management to implement a comprehensive EAP program and training. So our receptionist was actually trained on what to do. She saw the man coming for the door. She identified his drunken state and the gun, which he was not hiding. She locked the front door. She called out the active shooter code word that we had on the loudspeaker, and the building was shut down in a matter of seconds. Now, all our employees were safe, luckily, and the police arrived minutes later to arrest him after the receptionist called 911. But that situation could have ended so differently if our receptionist was not paying attention and was not trained to understand how critical her role was to the safety of our employees as the main person who greets everyone who entered our facility. Now, because she was aware and she was trained, she saved lives. And that's really what the purpose of an EAP is to make sure that in the event of emergency, employees know what to do and that no lives are lost or people are injured. Obviously, those are the things we want to avoid happening. So now, like I said before, many states have their own state-specific OSHA approved state plans, and there are a total of 21 states that have additional requirements on top of federal OSHA that may need to be included in your EAP or general safety trainings and considerations. And some of these may even be industry specific. So if you're in construction or any type of machinery and manufacturing, you have a lot more stringent requirements of you from a safety determination across the board. But the following states have additional requirements on top of the federal OSHA standards. So that's Alaska, Arizona, California, which I'm sure if you are out of California, you've heard of Cal OSHA, Hawaii, Iowa, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, Puerto Rico, South Carolina, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, Vermont, Washington, and Wyoming. And if you want more information on this, because there are a lot of state-specific laws and too many to go over in one webinar, you can actually visit www.osha.gov/state plans to take a look at your specific state requirements. And they go into really great detail, which is awesome. So when we give you a bunch of information like this, especially as it pertains to compliance, I always like to end the presentation on an action item slide to give you an idea of where to go from here with the information we have provided. So as far as next steps go, if you have an EAP already in place, be sure that you are reviewing it annually for updates and making sure that you're meeting state requirements as these may change. Now, you may also want to consider adding any new pandemic-related procedures that you have adopted over the last year. Also, while reviewing it, make sure that all employees are still active if they have a safety role. If not, you will need to reassign this role. Also, keep in mind that you cannot mandate an employee to take a safety role. It is a request. You have to ask them if they are willing to take the safety role and be a part of the process. They do have the ability to say no. You also want to make sure you are planning and conducting training annually for employees so they're familiar with the procedures and prepared for any type of emergency that may apply. And finally, make it a point to schedule and execute at least one evacuation drill per emergency event. So for example, in California, you may have two drills per year, a fire drill evacuation and an earthquake shelter in place drill that's followed by an evacuation. And those would be two separate drills that you need to run because they're going to be handled two different ways because of the different emergencies. Now, on the other hand, if you do not have an EAP plan in place, start working on developing an EAP in your workplace. I've included a checklist resource from the OSHA website as a help for you. It's in the handout section along with a copy of this PDF presentation. And you can download the handout in the handout section and use that as a guide to help you start going through your EAP and making sure that it is compliant with what they require in it. If this is something that you do not want to tackle yourself, it's totally understandable. There's a lot to it, but our HR services team can help. You can reach out to either myself or Kathy after the webinar, and we can get you a quote on getting an EAP started developing for you, and we will work together with you on that project. Also, once you have an EAP finalized, you can choose a time frame to focus on safety and roll out the new EAP in one complete comprehensive implementation. As a recommendation, we can always shoot for June. June is actually National Safety Month, and this is a great time to implement any new safety procedures, do safety education. You can roll out a new EAP, do training, as well as do evacuation drills during this month to really focus on safety education. All right, well, if you did not get a chance, feel free to take a second right now and ask any questions via the question box. But just as a reminder, this presentation was recorded and it will be available to watch again. To do that, you can visit www.payentry.com and hover your mouse over the webinars tab at the top and click on webinar recordings. The most recent recordings will be on top, and these are usually posted within 24 hours of the live webinar. You will also be emailed a copy of the webinar recording tomorrow afternoon. There's also a survey that follows this webinar, so feel free to leave your feedback and let us know if you have any suggestions for any topics that you might want to see on our 2021 webinar schedule. All right, let's see if we have any questions. All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions today, which is totally fine, but I want to thank you all for your time today. I hope you learned a lot about the information presented to you today. If you do have questions, feel free to shoot me an email. My contact information is at the bottom of this slide. Additionally, next week, Kathy is going to be presenting on the FLSA, or Fair Labor Standards Act, and talking about how to correctly classify and pay your employees. We've actually gotten a lot of questions on this topic lately, and we think that a webinar will be a great way to get those questions answered for everyone. Also, we have a special webinar coming up, which you will receive an email about probably next week. But on April 6th, we are going to be rolling out our official HR services compliance package. And so we want to talk to you a little bit about what's included in that package, what the price point is, and if it would be a good fit for your organization. This webinar is up on the website if you want to pre-register for it now. If not, you can wait for the email that will come out probably beginning of next week. Well, I look forward to seeing you guys at these upcoming webinars. You have a great rest of your day.